Have you ever wondered how much of our world was already known, long before our textbooks claim it was discovered? Because in the winter of 1895, something strange began to surface. Not in the capitals of great empires, not in the universities that guarded official history, but in forgotten archives, dusty attics, and private collections kept far away from public eyes. Maps. Maps that should not exist. Maps showing continents in the wrong shapes. Civilizations where no civilization should have been. And coastlines drawn with a precision our technology supposedly did not achieve until centuries later. Some of them were printed, some hand-drawn, some copied from sources so ancient no one could trace their origin, and yet they all pointed to the same unsettling truth. The old world did not look the way we are told it did, and whoever created these maps knew something global, something powerful, something that was later erased. By 1895, scholars began whispering about them. Governments began confiscating them. Institutions quietly revised their catalogs, and within a single generation, many of these maps simply vanished. What were they hiding? Why were these maps forbidden? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, who drew the original world before history was rewritten? This is the mystery of the forbidden maps of 1895, a cartographic echo of a forgotten civilization many now call Tartaria. Part 1. The year the world changed. In the winter of 1895, the world believed it understood itself. Empires stretched confidently across continents, their borders drawn in crisp black ink on the atlases that filled university halls and colonial offices. Geography was, in the minds of scholars, a finished science, a discipline that had mapped and measured every inhabitable corner of the earth. The age of exploration, they declared, was over. Only the poles remained mysterious. Only a few jungles still resisted the ambition of cartographers. And yet, quietly, beneath this facade of certainty, something far more unsettling was happening. Because 1895 was also the year a small but explosive collection of strange maps began to surface. Maps that should not exist. Maps whose details contradict every accepted timeline, and maps whose origins were so obscure that even the archivists who found them could not explain how they ended up in their collections. They were dismissed as curiosities, then anomalies, then increasingly as threats. Not because they depicted mythical lands, but because they depicted the familiar world in ways that were entirely unfamiliar. Continents shaped differently, coastlines impossibly accurate for their time, cities appearing centuries before their official founding, and most troubling of all, traces of a civilization not found in any textbook, yet present on multiple unrelated documents. Some called it coincidence, others called it a problem. But a very small number, a group of scholars who became ghosts in their own institutions, believed they were staring at the last remaining fingerprints of a global civilization erased from history. A civilization whose remnants many now call Tartaria, the archive room where it began. The first spark ignited in an unlikely place, a basement archive in the University of Turin, where an assistant librarian named Adriano Bellucci was tasked with sorting old military maps from the Savoyard period. Among stacks of brittle rolls and worm-eaten atlases, he found something out of place. a perfectly preserved map wrapped in cloth far finer than anything else in the archive. No dust, no mold. As if it had been placed there deliberately and recently. When he unrolled it, he froze. The script resembled a mixture of Latin and Old Church Slavonic, but the phrasing matched neither. The paper was unlike any paper from the 18th or 19th century, and the map itself. It showed Eurasia, but with coastlines matching satellite accuracy, despite being dated Anno 1531. It identified river systems not officially charted until the 19th century. It marked the borders of an empire labeled Tartaria Magna, stretching across modern Russia, Mongolia, and parts of China. Bellucci thought he had discovered a forgery, but two details made that conclusion impossible. The paper fibers matched no known industrial process, and under light, a subtle crystalline shimmer appeared, like the fibers were mixed with powdered glass. The ink contained trace elements used in medieval manuscripts. But the precision of the lines suggested a tool far beyond a quill. He brought the map to his supervisor. By morning, the map was gone. The archivist denied ever seeing it, and Bellucci, shaken, wrote in his private journal something that would resurface decades later. If what I held is authentic, then the history of the world is incomplete. Someone mapped the earth with knowledge we are told did not exist in that century. Someone mapped an empire we are told never existed, and someone does not want this map studied. 2 weeks after this entry, Bellucci resigned without explanation. He never returned to academia. 1895. A pattern begins. In isolation, the Turin incident would be a footnote, but 1895 produced more than one impossible map. That same year in Boston, a set of private auction documents describe a pre-Columbian map of the American coastline with accuracy matching naval charts from the 1800s. The buyer requested anonymity. The auction house insisted the map be destroyed. In St. Petersburg, scholars reported that a collection of imperial atlases had been abruptly reclassified as politically sensitive, and no explanation was given for the restriction. In Tokyo, a researcher found evidence of a medieval Japanese map showing rivers in Siberia far beyond the range of any known expeditions. And in Paris, at the Bibliothèque Nationale, a catalogue entry was quietly edited. A map, previously listed as 16th century anomalous, was suddenly relabeled. Origin uncertain. Access restricted. No reason, no commentary, no academic debate. Just a note, the first of many, that something about these maps made institutions deeply uncomfortable. When historians across Europe later compared their experiences, one observation emerged. 1895 was not the year these maps were created. It was the year they began to reappear. It was as if something had loosened in the archives, or perhaps someone had started to look for something, and in doing so, triggered a silent response. Why 1895? To understand why forbidden maps surfaced in the same year across multiple continents, we must step back and look at the world of 1895. The telegraph had connected the old world in ways unimaginable just decades before. Railways had opened remote regions and sparked new surveying projects. The photographic plate allowed scholars to reproduce documents precisely, and colonial empires were consolidating their power, redrawing boundaries according to their own needs, not historical ones. In this climate, historians and cartographers began revisiting old collections, re-examining old documents with modern tools, and sometimes stumbling on things that contradicted the very foundations of their scholarship. But there is another explanation, less official and far more unsettling. Because multiple letters, personal journals, and unpublished manuscripts from that year hint at something else. A rumor circulating among scholars, archivists, and museum workers. A rumor that an unidentified individual, or perhaps a group, was quietly searching for maps of the old empire. No one agreed on who they were. No one agreed on what they wanted. But they all agreed on one thing. If a map showed evidence of a forgotten global civilization, it disappeared. If it contradicted official chronologies, it disappeared. If it named Tartaria, it vanished without a trace. Which begs the question, if these maps were simply harmless mistakes, why did they require removal? The forbidden features. Those who saw the maps, even briefly, described certain recurring features. When placed side by side, a strange pattern emerges. 1. Premature geographic knowledge. Maps dated centuries before the age of exploration showing the correct shapes of continents, the exact routes of rivers, the precise placement of mountain ranges, coastlines unchanged even by modern satellite comparison. This accuracy should not exist without advanced tools. Tools historians insist were not available. 2. The phantom cities. Multiple maps depict large settlements in Siberia, Central Asia, and the Pacific Northwest, cities with names unlike any in known history. Some maps even show architectural drawings, star fort designs, canals, vast geometric layouts. Yet no ruins are acknowledged, no excavation reports, no historical mentions, as if these cities were systematically removed from history. 3. The Tartarian crest. The most controversial detail appears only on a handful of maps, but it cannot be ignored. A symbol resembling a double-headed eagle, subtly different from the Russian or Byzantine versions, placed over regions identified as Tartaria Magna. On some maps, the crest includes a crown shaped not like European designs, but like a stepped ziggurat, a symbol with roots in Central Asia, not Europe. If these maps are authentic, they suggest Tartaria was not a vague tribal region, but a centralized political entity. 4. The chronological anomalies dates do not match political borders. Borders do not match historical events. Cities appear centuries early, sometimes centuries late. In other words, the maps describe a timeline that diverges from the one we are taught. The scholars who tried to sound the alarm before. The maps vanished into restricted archives or private collections. A few scholars attempted to document them. Their stories are remarkably similar. Sudden professional isolation funding cuts pressure to retract preliminary findings destroyed correspondence in one case. A mysterious fire in an office following the publication of a single essay. These scholars were not conspiracy theorists. They were respected academics whose careers abruptly ended the moment they suggested that the world before the 17th century may have been far more interconnected and far more civilized than official history allows. Their unpublished letters reveal their frustration. If one map disagrees with the narrative, we dismiss the map. If dozens disagree, perhaps we should question the narrative. But questioning the narrative in 1895 was dangerous because empires were built on those narratives: territories, borders, identities, rights to land and resources. To admit that earlier maps showed a different world was to admit that the foundations of these empires were shaken. And so, the maps became forbidden. The quiet erasure begins. By the end of 1895, reports of strange maps appearing in archives suddenly stopped. Access restrictions increased. Catalogs were rewritten. Certain maps were reclassified as misdated. Suspected forgeries, or, in the most extreme cases, lost. Some were genuinely lost. Others were simply removed. A few surviving notes from archivists suggest that they were asked by unnamed individuals to surrender maps not matching approved chronologies. The phrase appears repeatedly: not aligned with historical consensus, chronologically corrupted, inconsistent with established development timelines. These are not scientific reasons for removal. These are political reasons. And they imply that someone, somewhere, understood the significance of these maps. A final question before part 2. Why did forbidden maps begin resurfacing across multiple continents in the same year? Was it coincidence? A surge in archival research? A misdating phenomenon? Or did someone start looking for these maps in 1895 and someone else started taking them away? Because the deeper we follow this trail, the clearer the pattern becomes. History was not rewritten in the past. It was rewritten in the 19th century. And the maps that contradicted the new version were the first to disappear. Part 2. The Cartographers who should not exist. There is an unsettling truth hidden beneath the polished surface of 19th century cartography. A truth rarely acknowledged and almost never examined in academic circles. Behind the maps that rewrote the world in 1895 stand individuals who should not, by any reasonable historical logic, exist. Men whose training is undocumented. Surveyors who appear in the archives suddenly, already experts. Cartographers whose skills vastly exceed the tools of their time. Map makers whose work reveals knowledge they could not have possessed unless they were drawing from something older, something forbidden. And it is in their shadows, in their abrupt disappearances, in the strange silences surrounding their careers, that the story of the forbidden maps begins to take shape. 1. The strange birth of the phantom cartographers. Throughout the 19th century, official cartography was supposed to be a bureaucratic process. Surveyors trained in state academies, naval officers mapping coastlines, university researchers compiling data. Yet, when one examines the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, the Russian Hydrographic Department, the French Dépôt de la Marine, or the newly formed U.S. Geological Survey, a disturbing pattern emerges. Entire careers exist only as fragments: a few published maps, a letter or two, a signature on a survey. Then nothing. No personal documents, no graduation records, no pension files, no death certificates. Historians call them phantom cartographers. I prefer the term inheritors, because their work often resembles not an act of discovery, but an act of preservation. They drew lands with the confidence of someone remembering, not exploring, and their precision raises questions no one has been willing to confront. 2. the impossible precision of N.K. Mikhailov. Take, for example, the case of Nikolai Konstantinovich Mikhailov, a figure who appears in only 4 surviving documents in the Russian Cartographic archives. His surviving maps, all dated between 1881 and 1887, display a precision that should have been impossible without aerial surveys or advanced geodesic instruments. He mapped river deltas with exact sediment patterns, mountain ridges with elevations later confirmed by 20th century satellite data, coastlines with erosion levels matching modern laser scans, underground aquifers only rediscovered a century later. And yet, Mikhailov worked alone, with instruments officially no more advanced than brass compasses and optical theodolites. His peers wrote in their reports, Mikhailov produces surveys as if he has already seen the terrain. He draws the invisible. But the strangest detail is not the quality of his maps. It is his disappearance. In 1887, after submitting a final set of charts covering remote regions east of the Urals, Mikhailov left the hydrographic department building for lunch and was never seen again. No investigation, no public notice, no search. His apartment was found emptied, his personal journals were removed, his instruments gone, and most telling of all, his maps were immediately reclassified and removed from circulation. Why? The official line claims technical inaccuracies, but subsequent researchers who saw the originals privately called them disturbing, anachronistic, and too complete. 3. The Silent Jesuit, Father Antonio Serras. Another figure appears around the same period, though half a continent away. Father Antonio Serras, a Jesuit missionary assigned to the Amazon basin. His story is even stranger. Jesuit cartographers were known for immense precision, yet Serras's maps stand apart for a simple reason. He mapped cities no longer found today, and forests that did not exist then, and rivers whose courses were later proven to have shifted centuries before his birth. Serras's 1889 chart of the Upper Xingu, for example, depicts a network of geometric earthworks only rediscovered by LIDAR in the 2010s, causeways buried under centuries of soil, settlement grids with exact modular proportions, and monumental mounds resembling old-world step pyramids. His supervisors questioned his methods. Serras responded cryptically, "I am only restoring what was once known." But the Vatican's reaction was swift and startling. All of Serras's maps were seized, his journals confiscated, his mission reassigned. He was sent to Rome for evaluation. He died less than a year later. Cause of death? Unspecified. And the maps? They remain locked in the Archivum Romanum Societatis Iesu, accessible only by special permission. Why would the Church imprison maps unless they threatened established historical chronology? What had Serras restored? 4. The man who drew continents before they were explored. Then there is the case of the enigmatic French mapmaker, Edmond de L'Isle de Ventadour. He appears in the records of the Dépôt de la Marine in 1892, submits 2 atlases in 1895, and vanishes in 1896. His atlases were considered controversial even at the time, for a simple reason. They contain knowledge France did not possess. His 1895 Atlas du Monde Septentrional includes an accurate coastline of Antarctica decades before aerial mapping, inland mountain ranges that match modern radar surveys beneath the ice, lakes hidden under glaciers, and a landmass described as Terre Boreale north of Alaska, a landmass erased in later cartographic revisions. Some historians chalk this up to artistic impression, but Ventadour was not an artist. He was meticulous, mathematical, obsessive, and he left one line in his notebook, the only surviving sentence in his handwriting. The old maps were correct. We only forgot how to read them. This implies that Ventadour did not discover anomalies. He found them. He accessed older charts that have since disappeared from the archives, charts that contradict our official history of exploration. 5. The Cartographic Brotherhoods. When we lay these cases side by side, Mikhailov, Saras, Ventadour, a disturbing common thread emerges. None of them appear to have been trained in official institutions. Their methods are undocumented. Their careers are fragmented. Their output is extraordinary. And their disappearances are too convenient. Historians have quietly identified traces of informal cartographic brotherhoods operating throughout the 19th century. Groups not affiliated with states or academies. They used symbols, annotations, and coordinate systems inconsistent with any known tradition. Their notes reference prior charts, the old delineations, surveys of the first cycle, the primordial grid. What was this grid? Who taught them? And the real question, were these brotherhoods preserving fragments of a lost global mapping tradition? One that predated modern nations. One that belonged to an older civilization. Perhaps the same one whose echoes we see in Tartarian architecture, star fort geometry, and abandoned infrastructures scattered across continents. 6. The anomalous tools. Several surviving instruments associated with these cartographers further deepen the mystery. The Mikhailov compass, stored in the St. Petersburg Naval Museum. This brass compass contains markings not used in any Russian geodesic system. It is calibrated to a magnetic variation that matches neither 19th century measurements nor modern ones. Some researchers suspect it was designed to align with a different magnetic epoch, centuries earlier. Saras's theodolite. Unlike any Jesuit instrument from the period, it includes crosshair lenses with micro-etchings, angular calibrations to 3 decimal places, a precision not achieved until the early 20th century, and an inscription. Repositorium Mundi, Sectio 9. Repository of the World. Section 9. What repository? Where are sections 1 through 8? Ventadour's nautical divider. Recovered from his effects and stored in a private collection, it is made from an alloy unknown in French naval metallurgy of the time. The divider's length corresponds not to metric or imperial units, but to an archaic cubit system recurring in ancient architecture across the Old World. Why would a 19th century cartographer be using measurements tied to Egyptian temples and Eurasian steppe pyramids? Unless he was aligning his maps to an older template. 7. The sudden rewriting of cartographic standards, 1895. It is no coincidence that 1895, the very year Ventadour released his controversial atlas, marks a radical restructuring of cartographic norms across Europe and America. Multiple institutions issued near-simultaneous directives: removal of obsolete atlases, recalibration of meridians, standardization of projection methods, destruction of redundant or erroneous charts, reclassification of non-conforming documents. In each case, the justification was vague. Scientific clarity, international alignment, reduction of confusion. But independent archivists have noted that the maps targeted were disproportionately older and disturbingly accurate. And many of them bear the signatures, initials, or annotations of the phantom cartographers. It is as if the institutions of the modern world, governments, academies, churches, moved together to erase a knowledge system they did not create, a legacy they could not explain. 8. What did these cartographers know? The deeper one goes, the clearer the pattern becomes. These individuals were not merely map makers. They were custodians. Their work implies knowledge of ancient coastlines before sea level rise, pre-glacial landmasses, lost river systems, abandoned megalithic networks, planetary grids, magnetic alignments no longer used, and settlements erased before recorded history. They were not creating maps out of speculative imagination. They were restoring something, piecing together fragments, guarding a memory older than our historical chronology allows. 9. The forbidden curriculum. The most shocking discovery, however, comes from a set of handwritten notes found in a sealed box in the University of Kazan archives. The notes describe a cartographic curriculum, instruction in polar triangulation, lessons in terrestrial resonance patterns, training in pre-diluvian coastlines, study of the foundational grid, exercises in reading the hidden meridians. The handwriting is believed to belong to Mikhailov. At the end of the document is a chilling statement. When the old knowledge is forbidden, the map makers must go silent. The world must be drawn again without memory. This is the closest thing we have to a confession. A whisper from the shadows. 10. A pattern too consistent to ignore. 3 cartographers separated by continents, institutions, beliefs, and languages. And yet, their methods are unexplainable. Their precision is impossible. Their careers are eerily brief. Their disappearances are suspicious. Their maps contradict official history. Their knowledge points to something older. Their work was suppressed. Their archives were sealed. Their tools were anomalies. Their legacy was erased around 1895. This is not coincidence. It is convergence. And convergence implies origin, a source, a school, a lineage, a surviving thread of a lost world's cartographers, still visible in the margins of forbidden maps. The phantom cartographers were not inventing a new world. They were preserving the memory of an old one, a world erased, a world rewritten, a world whose geography, and perhaps whose civilization, was deliberately removed from our collective history. But if these individuals were inheritors of a forgotten mapping tradition, where did that tradition originate? And what happened to the older maps they once used? Part 3. The cartographers who knew too much. By the time we left the archive that night, one realization refused to let go. It wasn't just that the 1895 maps were different. It was that they were all different in the same way. Coastlines simplified in the same regions. River systems corrected along the same paths. Cities quietly downgraded or erased in the same zones, as if a single invisible editor had run a red pen across the old world, and every cartographer had simply obeyed. But maps are not written in the passive tense. Somebody made those decisions. Someone, somewhere, told them what to draw. And that is where the trail of the forbidden maps really begins to twist. The signature in the margin. If you look closely at old maps, past the coastlines and engraved lettering, you start to notice something else. The small, almost apologetic marks made by the people who created them. Tiny initials, dates squeezed into corners, printer's stamps barely visible. In several of the 1895 sheets, just where the paper disappears into the binding, a faint inscription appears. Not a publisher, not a location, a name, or perhaps a code. 3 letters written in a tight, slanted hand that appears again and again. CRX, sometimes followed by a dot, sometimes not. Always in the same place, where the correction lines cluster the most. On one map, the original river network is still faintly visible beneath the ink. A wide tributary snakes across a region that, officially, should not be flooded. Over it, darker and sharper, a new line cuts a different path. Near the crossing point, nestled between contour marks, the same inscription reappears. CRX. Who or what was that? A revisor? A secret committee? An internal reference used only by those in the trade? In the catalog, there is no mention of any CRX. No author, no engraver, no surveyor under those initials. The official credits list only the publisher and the sponsoring academy. But the maps themselves tell a different story, almost as if someone left a quiet protest in the margins. I was here. I changed this. Look closer. The quiet meeting of 1895. There is another strange detail about that year. In 1895, a conference was held in Europe, barely referenced today outside of specialized archives, ostensibly dedicated to standardizing geographic notation for educational maps. An innocent goal on le papier. The minutes, where they still exist, speak in dull, bureaucratic language, harmonization, pedagogical clarity, removal of confusing redundancies. But maps are rarely changed for clarity alone. Once you know what to look for, a curious pattern appears in the aftermath of this meeting. Towns that appear on pre-1890 regional charts, sometimes for centuries, suddenly vanish from later editions. Mountain ranges are smoothed, their jagged, complex relief replaced with softer lines, especially in areas where old legends spoke of forbidden valleys or sunken cities. Ancient trade routes, once traced meticulously across entire continents, are reduced to broken, disconnected segments, as if the paths themselves had been shattered. And astonishingly, the bulk of these changes begin appearing in printed atlases from 1895 onwards, as if that meeting, barely footnoted in modern textbooks, had quietly redrawn the memory of the world, not its borders, its past. And among the few maps where both the before and after versions survived, the same mysterious signature appears near the altered zones. CRX. Was this a person sent to implement the new standard, an anonymous engraver following orders, or the discreet mark of a group whose name never made it into the public record? There is no proof, but every anomaly pulls in the same direction. Phantom coastlines. If the forbidden maps were purely symbolic, a matter of renaming territories, inventing a few lines, perhaps the story would end here. But some changes suggest something far more unsettling. Physical geography rewritten. Take the northern coastlines of the Old World. Earlier charts from the mid-1800s show a world of complexity. Fjord-like inlets, small islands dotted like stepping stones, peculiar sandbanks recorded with obsessive care. Mariners depended on such details. A misplaced shoal could mean a wreck. And yet, in several 1895 atlases, those same coasts are simplified. Not by improved surveying, which would usually add detail, but by removal. Minor islands vanish completely. Whole delta systems are reduced to a single generic river opening. Repeated mentions of variable shoreline due to subsidence disappear from the legend. To the casual reader, nothing seems amiss. A coastline is a coastline, but if you overlay the older maps with the newer ones, something strange happens. Whole stretches of land that once appeared as low-lying plains, prone to flooding, marked with settlements, now look as if they were never meant to exist. Almost as if the maps were trying to erase the memory of a flood, or something that followed it. In isolated maritime logs and weather reports from the 19th century, there are references to sudden alterations in known coasts, new sandbars, entire villages swallowed by inexplicable earth movements. Officially, these are catalogued as local disasters, unfortunate but limited. Unofficially, when you line them up, they trace a pattern that matches almost perfectly. The regions most aggressively simplified in 1895. The cities that lost their past. The most unsettling anomalies, however, are not in the wild edges of the map, but in the cities, especially those whose architecture still whispers of an older, unexplained grandeur. In one imperial capital, the 1895 city map redraws an entire district. Earlier plans show wide boulevards radiating from a central plaza, flanked by monumental buildings whose purpose is cryptically labeled Hall of Mechanical Studies, Acoustic Observatory, Hydraulic Depot. But in the 1895 revision, those names are gone. The buildings are still there, their footprints unchanged. Yet on the map, they have become Administrative Office, Municipal Storage, Technical School, defunct. The Central Plaza loses its original name, a term associated with Universal Exhibition in older documents, and is simply renamed Market Square. Even more curious, a railway spur that once connected this district to a large river harbor disappears altogether from the official city plan, despite being physically present in photographs taken in the early 1900s. Someone did not simply update the city. They updated the story of the city. The revision is so thorough, so carefully executed, that by the time the 20th century arrives, almost no one seems to remember what the district was originally built for. Official guides describe it as an administrative quarter. Yet hidden in the margins of one 1895 map near the erased railway line, the same three letters appear again, almost swallowed by the ink of a contour line. CRX, the vanishing index. If you want to know what has been erased, one of the simplest tricks is to look at the index, not the map. Indexes are dangerous for anyone trying to rewrite reality. They leave behind ghosts. In one of the atlases tied to the 1895 standardization, the alphabetical index of place names includes entries that lead nowhere. Page references that point to map plates not present in the volume. Coordinates that, when checked against the grid, correspond to empty fields or nameless hills. mentions of rivers that do not exist on any chart in the book. To an impatient student, it's a printing error. To a librarian, a minor annoyance. But to someone comparing multiple editions across years, a pattern emerges. Some of the missing places correspond to cities that appear prominently in older gazetters, often described as important trading hubs or cultural centers. A few match the locations of now-ruined complexes whose architecture seems far too advanced for their official dating. Others align with zones marked in obscure geological notes as areas of catastrophic subsidence or unusual sedimentary layering around the late 18th to early 19th centuries. In other words, the index remembers what the map no longer dares to show. By the time later editions are printed, even these ghost entries have been cleaned up. The missing pages are renumbered, the gaps closed, the anomalies smoothed away. But in the 1895 wave, the moment of transition, there is just enough left to suggest that the erasure was not a natural drift of publishing. It was a surgery, performed in stages. An older template. There is one last clue that pushes this story beyond the comfortable realm of editorial changes. In a private collection, far from public reading rooms, surfaces an incomplete proof sheet. It appears to be a working plate from the late 19th century, the kind used by engravers before final printing. At first glance, it resembles any other partially inked map: coastlines, rivers, relief. But beneath the delicate engravings, faint and almost spectral, a second map can be seen. Not printed, impressed. Lines that do not quite match the official geography. City symbols where no modern city is supposed to be. Latitude and longitude marks that are offset by just enough to suggest a different underlying grid. As if the engraver had been tracing over something much older, and only half managed to hide it. In some spots, the underlying coastlines align perfectly with older pre-cataclysm charts from centuries past. In others, they correspond to no known record at all, hinting at a geography that predates not just our maps, but perhaps our current civilization's arrangement of land and sea. If that sheet is genuine, and every forensic analysis of the paper and ink suggests it is, then the 1895 maps were not the product of pure invention. They were adaptations of something older, something global, something that did not fit the new narrative of who built what and when. A template that might well belong to the very civilization that some now call Tartaria. The shadow of an invisible academy. Every document points in the same direction. Someone or some group had both the authority and the reach to convene cartographers and publishers across nations, dictate which features would remain and which would disappear, access older source maps that are now quietly locked away or destroyed, and leave behind almost no trace in public records. What kind of institution has that power over knowledge, yet avoids the spotlight of history? The obvious candidates step forward: imperial academies, royal societies, military cartographic offices. Their archives are vast, their influence undeniable. And yet, in the letters of the time, in private correspondence between bewildered map makers, a different tone appears. Hints of external instructions, non-negotiable revisions, sources provided under condition of confidentiality. As if a shadow academy, one without an official seal, hovered just beyond the threshold of the recognized ones, feeding them corrections that they were obliged to implement. We do not know its name, we do not know its structure, but we see its fingerprints in the vanished towns, in the simplified coasts, in the renamed districts and censored legends, and in 3 letters scattered like breadcrumbs across the forbidden maps of 1895, CRX. Were they a person, forced to participate and quietly signing their work in protest? A small internal code for correction revision extra? Or the abbreviation of an institution whose full name has been deliberately withheld? For now, it remains an unanswered question. But one final trail remains to be followed. Because somewhere, buried in the catalog of an old institution that insists it has nothing unusual in its collection, lies a box of documents that should not exist. Drafts of maps that show the world not as it was decided in 1895, but as it might have looked before the Great Erasure. In the next part, we step into one of the last places on Earth where such drafts may still be hiding. An unremarkable reading room, in an unremarkable building, guarding a set of documents so quietly dangerous that the safest way to deal with them may have been to pretend they were never there at all. Part Wepor, the cartographers who shouldn't have known. They were not explorers, not archaeologists, not mystics claiming visions of forgotten ages. They were map makers, men whose lives revolved around measurements, coastlines, meridians, and the mechanical precision of surveying tools. And yet, in the late 1800s, especially around the strangely pivotal year 1895, these men began drawing coastlines, mountain ranges, river systems, and even entire land masses they should not have known. Lines that did not exist in any official survey. Contours that contradicted imperial archives. Cities that predated the nations claiming to govern them. Infrastructure that, even today, we cannot explain. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't error. It wasn't artistic flourish. The deeper you look, the more you notice something unsettling. These map makers were pulling from a source that has never been publicly identified. And whatever that source was, it wasn't meant for ordinary eyes. 1. The shadow archive behind the maps. In academic circles, it is called the invisible corpus, a polite nickname for a body of documents that technically does not exist. But references to it appear everywhere in the notes and diaries of 19th century cartographers. Consulted the old sheets. Copied from the ancient series. Corrected using the forbidden register. Not one of these collections is catalogued. Not one appears in the surviving archives of the empires of the time. And yet almost every prestigious mapmaker between 1870 and 1900 mentions them. Worse still, the corrections they made using these mysterious old sheets were always the same. Rivers extended farther back in time than imperial textbooks allowed. Coastlines matched descriptions from medieval sailors no historian believed. Mountain ranges followed geometric alignments that no natural process could produce. And in some cases, continents were drawn with infrastructure that had no analog in any known civilization. This is not accidental. The pattern is too consistent, too global, too synchronized. Someone, or something, provided late 19th century cartographers with a reference map of an older world. a world that no longer existed in 1895 and is not acknowledged today. 2. The forbidden geometry of the Old World historians frequently dismiss early inaccuracies in maps as simple mistakes. But the problem here is the opposite. These so-called inaccuracies are too advanced, too precise, too consistent. Across dozens of maps from 1880, 1895, you will find perfectly straight alignments between ancient cities, lines that cross continents with engineering precision, grid-like geographies implied beneath landscapes, a kind of master layout under rivers, mountain ranges, and prehistoric settlements. Identical anomalies across maps from different nations, even when cartographers had no contact with one another. Redacted features present only on early prints. Entire networks of what appears to be infrastructure, canals, causeways, terraces, and geometric fields that vanished from later editions, as if someone saw the first versions and decided they revealed too much. The fact that these elements appear most prominently in maps published in or around 1895 is not a coincidence, because that year, more than any other, seems to mark a turning point where some maps were allowed to slip through with glimpses of an older world, and a silent campaign began to erase those glimpses forever. 3. The cartographers who disappeared. Every researcher eventually reaches the same disturbing observation. Some of the most important cartographers of the late 19th century simply vanish. Not metaphorically, not career-wise, literally. Letters stop, publications stop, academy memberships end without explanation. In several cases, their homes were cleared, their tools confiscated, their drafts and notebooks removed from archives, their final projects left unfinished in printing houses, and no one, not universities, not families, not governments, ever officially commented on their absence. Here are 3 examples among many. J. Felkman, Austria-Hungary, published a series of Balkan maps showing a network of ancient geometric canals. His final work, dated 1895, was seized before release. He vanished 3 months later. N. Ravelin, France, produced corrected Eurasian projections using sources he never identified. His 1894 to 1896 journals reference the older plates. After January 1896, his name disappears completely. The North Sea Group, a collective of Dutch cartographers whose shared maps showed anomalous structures beneath the water, shapes resembling foundations or ruins. The group dissolved without reason. All their archives were removed by state order. What were these people seeing? What were they copying? And why did someone find it necessary to erase them? 4. The quiet war over the old world. The easiest assumption is censorship, governments restricting sensitive details. But this explanation collapses immediately. These anomalies appear across rival empires, across competing scientific academies, across mutually hostile political blocs, across printing houses with no shared oversight. There was no central authority capable of coordinating a global redaction in 1895. And yet the redaction happened, simultaneously. If the same details were removed from maps in Russia, France, Britain, Turkey, Denmark, and the United States, then the censorship was not political, not national, not bureaucratic. It was historical. Someone was trying to bury the memory of a world that existed before modern nations, a world whose infrastructure may have been global, whose design was geometric, and whose knowledge was far beyond what 19th century empires wanted to admit. This is why 1895 matters so much. It is the year when the old world flickered into view one last time, not through archaeology or myth, but through cartography. Because maps, more than books or monuments, tell the truth governments cannot fully control. A map is a confession, a glimpse, a trace of something that came before. And in the 1890s, too many maps confessed too much. 5. The last map makers who fought back. A handful of cartographers, aware of what was happening, attempted to resist. They embedded clues in shadows, margins, odd coordinate systems, and decorative artwork. A swirling cloud might hide the outline of a forgotten coastline. A compass rose might conceal an ancient alignment. A decorative border might contain the geometry of an erased city. These quiet rebellions are still visible today, if you know what to look for. Some even left cryptic notes in Latin, French, or Old German. Non omnia deleta. Not everything was destroyed. Vetustiora quam imperium. Older than the empire. Iterum apparebit. It will appear again. Were they warning us, or documenting their defeat? We cannot know. Because by 1900, almost all surviving cartographers were working under new standards of compliance enforced by national geographic societies. And the old references, the ancient series, the forbidden registers, the old plates were gone. Destroyed, hidden, or returned to whoever provided them in the first place. That question has no answer. At least, not yet. Part 5. The Cartographers of Silence. There is a detail buried in the margins of old atlases, one that most readers never notice. It is not a symbol, not a forgotten peninsula, not even a misdrawn coastline. It is the silence. A silence that stretches across editions, across publishing houses, across kingdoms and empires that should have had nothing in common. A silence that grows not from what cartographers drew, but from what they chose to erase. Because by the late 1800s, the supposed golden age of exploration, maps were not expanding. They were contracting. Not because the world was becoming better understood, but because certain knowledge was being withdrawn, deliberately, carefully, and with a precision that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Every map tells a story, but the maps of 1895 tell a story in reverse, a story of worlds being folded inward, coastlines redrawn to erase unwanted interpretations, ancient territories compressed until their identities dissolved, and entire civilizations removed with the quiet finality of a rubber eraser dragged across parchment. Those who noticed this pattern early on called it the cartographer's silence, and its shadow stretches far deeper than geography. I. The vanishing symbols. Before the erasures came the symbols. Old maps, the truly old ones, the ones copied from sources we can no longer trace, were cluttered with markings, runes, constellations, sigils, astronomical alignments, annotations in strange alphabets. Some symbols correspond to known cultures, others belong to no linguistic family and no deciphered script. But something changed in the mid-1800s. The symbols began to disappear, not faded, not smudged, not forgotten, removed. Look closely at early engravings, the faint halo of a scraped chisel, the remnants of ink where something used to be. traces of varnish covering a corrected section. Even stranger is what replaces them: empty land, blank sea, a featureless plateau, as though meaning itself had been extracted. Some archivists, the few who still admit these details exist, believe that these effacements were part of a coordinated sanitization, not to protect accuracy, but to protect a story they did not want the world to remember. 2. The territories that should not have been empty. By 1895, map makers insisted that the world was fully charted, but earlier records, explorers' journals, trade logs, transit permits from empires long gone, tell another tale. Regions that once contained cities, citadels, and fortified settlements suddenly appear in later maps as empty stretches of uninhabited earth. A vast trading corridor recorded in an 1817 Ottoman survey becomes, by 1892, a barren wasteland. A group of fortified towns in Siberia, described in a 1760 Russian military ledger, vanish completely by the next century. A network of star-shaped strongholds documented in Dutch East India papers dissolves into nothing more than marshland. It is not that these places were destroyed, it is that their memory was intentionally unthreaded. Survey data replaced, coordinates reassigned, vegetation zones falsified to disguise the footprint of old foundations. Even the language of the land changed. Names that had persisted for centuries were overwritten with new designations, new narratives, new histories. What vanished in these regions was not merely geography. It was identity. It was culture. It was inheritance. And as the 19th century crept toward its final decade, something more disturbing emerged. These erasures followed a pattern. They erased not random settlements, not peripheral tribes, but nodes, strategic nodes, in what once appeared to be a connected, cross-continental civilization. A civilization that official history never acknowledges. A civilization some now whisper became known only under a single forbidden name: Tartaria. Third, the secret briefing of 1895. In an obscure archive in Vienna, there is a locked folder. Its contents are not publicly listed. Its title is coded in a way that defies normal cataloging practices. But a fragment of its inventory leaked in the 1930s, long after the original custodians had vanished. It describes a meeting in April 1895 between representatives of several European mapping agencies. The agenda of the meeting is simple: consistency of representation for disputed territories in Northern and Central Asia. But the minutes reveal something darker: a set of directives concerning what should be excluded from future maps. Among the forbidden annotations, references to imperial remnants predating current chronologies, symbols suggestive of astronomical governance, inscriptions of unknown, non-classifiable scripts, and any geographical feature implying the existence of previous large-scale infrastructure. In other words, do not show what cannot be explained. Do not map what does not fit the new timeline. Do not acknowledge what preceded the current order. The directive concludes with a chilling line: cartography must serve stability, not memory. To erase a memory, you do not destroy the building. You simply remove it from the map. IV. The cartographers who disappeared. A great many map makers of the late 1800s died in obscurity, but some did not merely fade away. They vanished. Records of their deaths are missing. Their families received no confirmations. Their unpublished works, drafts, sketches, annotated globes were seized, confiscated, or acquired by museums that have never displayed them. One of them, a French cartographer named Étienne Milot, left behind a chilling note found years later hidden in a hollow spine of a book. We were told to remove what we had no right to see in the first place, not because it was untrue, but because it was too true. Another, a Prussian surveyor named J. Adler, wrote, "They warned us that the past must be simplified, that complexity breeds rebellion, that we were mapping not the world, but the limits of permissible thought." The cartographers understood something few others realized. Maps are architecture for belief. Erase a civilization from the maps of the world, and within a generation its memory collapses. Erase its symbols, and the languages tied to them become undecipherable. Erase its borders, and future historians dismiss it as myth. By 1895, the erasure was nearly complete. Almost. V. The forbidden layer, the most disturbing detail hidden within the Atlas of 1895, is something only visible under infrared examination of certain plates. An underlayer, a ghost map, a discarded version of the world. This underlayer reveals 3 continents drawn with extended borders, dozens of starfort complexes spanning from the Baltic to Mongolia, river systems that no longer exist in the official timelines, and annotations referencing continuum routes, ether stations, and resonant corridors. None of these appear on the printed version. Someone, at some point, decided the world needed to be corrected into something smaller, simpler, more manageable. The underlayer suggests that the civilization we call Tartaria was not a loose federation, not a scattered culture, not an accidental cluster of architectural styles. It was a global network, with its own sciences, its own symbols, its own mapping system, and its own understanding of the Earth, one that modern maps deliberately suppress. Because beneath the official borders, beneath the political lines, beneath the mountains and seas drawn with ink and authority, there lies another world, a world whose outline is still faintly visible, if you know where to look. 6. The maps that refused to die. Not all the forbidden maps were destroyed. Some resurfaced in private collections, hidden between unrelated pages, or sold anonymously at estate auctions. They are fragmented, incomplete, and often in fragile condition. But they share traits too consistent to be accidental. They show structures larger than modern cities placed in regions listed in official maps as empty. Canals and waterways that crisscross territories supposedly untouched by engineered infrastructure. Circles and radial grids etched across steppes, deserts, and forests, as though indicating sites of long-lost power stations or ceremonial complexes, and notations pointing to a catastrophic event that altered coastlines, river directions, and population centers. Some include a cryptic symbol repeated again and again. A circle split vertically by a line, with 3 radiating marks above it. Historians have never classified it, but engineers recognize its shape instantly. It is the schematic for a tuning fork, scaled up beyond comprehension, as if the land itself was once part of a resonant system. A system later dismantled, buried, or rewritten, not just in stone, not just in architecture, but in memory. 7. The shadow that remains. By the end of 1895, the transition was complete. The world had absorbed the new maps. The old symbols were gone. The anomalous territories had been normalized. The public never noticed. Because silence is most powerful not when it hides information, but when it takes its place. What happened before the new maps, the true borders, the lost cities, the erased symbols, the resonant infrastructure, became a ghost story whispered only by archivists, renegade cartographers, and those who sensed that the world felt oddly incomplete, as though something immense had passed through history and left only its shadow. A shadow still visible in the cracks of forgotten atlases, in the margins of suppressed journals, in the uncorrected engravings of a few surviving plates. A shadow that reveals itself not through what is drawn, but through what was forbidden to draw. The maps did not simply misrepresent the world, they rewrote it. And long before modern geopolitics became entangled in borders and treaties, a different battle was fought. Not over land, but over perception, over memory, over continuity, over the right to define what the past was allowed to look like. The cartographers of silence may be gone, but their work endures. You can still feel it in the empty spaces where cities should be, in the erased symbols that flicker under old varnish, in the quiet contradictions that ripple across centuries of maps. Something was removed, something immense, something civilization-shaping, and every erased line, every vanished annotation, every corrected engraving points to a single unsettling truth. The world we inherited is not the world that once existed, not by accident, not by ignorance, but by design. And while the forbidden maps of the old world have faded, their outlines remain like phantom limbs of a forgotten giant. A reminder that history is not just written by the victors. It is drawn by those who decide what must never be seen again. Conclusion: where the lines fade. In the end, the maps of 1895 remain more than artifacts. They are fractures, small ruptures in the official story, through which an older world continues to bleed. A world whose borders were not the borders we were taught. Whose cities rose where no civilization was meant to be. Whose coastlines, rivers, and continents seemed to follow rules we no longer understand. Every cartographer who touched these forbidden charts left behind traces of hesitation. Crossed out lines, overwritten coastlines, erased symbols that still shadow the parchment. It is as if they were recording something that someone, somewhere, had already decided must be forgotten. Today, these maps survive only as ghosts, misfiled plates in dusty archives, mislabeled atlases sold at auctions, fragments scanned by collectors who did not realize what they had uncovered. But when you place them side by side, when you connect the lines that were never meant to be connected, a shape emerges. Not the shape of territories, nor kingdoms, nor empires, but the outline of a story that did not end with the 19th century. A story that was deliberately buried, redrawn, overwritten, not to protect us from the past, but to protect the past from us. Because the truth hidden beneath those vanished coastlines, beneath those erased cities, beneath those impossible symmetries and misplaced monuments, did not disappear on its own. Someone removed it. Someone decided what we were allowed to remember, and what we were never meant to see. The forbidden maps of 1895 are not just evidence, they are warnings, silent reminders that the world we know may only be a version, a revision, a carefully curated fragment of something infinitely older. And somewhere, beyond the archives, beyond the sealed collections, beyond the layers of dust and silence, the rest of the story is still waiting.